All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. You should be signed on to a webinar for the Humanitarian Evidence Program. If you're in the wrong place, we welcome you to stay anyway and listen to our great conversation. My name is Elizabeth Stites, and I'm a research director at the Feinstein International Center, which is at the Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University in Boston, Massachusetts. And I'm thrilled to welcome you all to this webinar, which is the third in our Humanitarian Evidence Program series. By yesterday morning, we had 139 registrants for this session today from over 39 countries, and we had great representation from a mix of UN, government and EU, NGO, Red Cross, Red Crescent, and then a mix of university, academic, and learning institutions. We also had a number of think tanks and individual consultants who had signed up. Over half of you said you had used systematic reviews in your work to date, and only 0.06 of you said that you don't use research evidence at all. So this means we're starting in a good place for the discussion about use of evidence and how we use evidence in this work. We're aware that all of us have different experiences across communities of practice and settings, and so we'll try to be as inclusive as possible in our discussions. We've scheduled 1.5 hours for this webinar. We'll be aiming to close by or before 4 p.m. UK time and 11 a.m. East Coast US time. You should be receiving instructions on how to send us questions via the chat box function in the webinar panel. Please feel free to send questions into us at any point. Our team here will be collating them, and we'll be attempting to get through as many of them as we can at the end of the session today. And just as a quick reminder, we are recording today's session. Any of you who are on the phone, calling in from your phone, please make sure that you're on mute. Everyone else is automatically muted if you're dialing up through your computer. So by way of introduction to the Humanitarian Evidence Program, it's a partnership between Oxfam and the Feinstein International Center at the Friedman School at Tufts University. And it's funded through the Humanitarian Innovation and Evidence Program at DFID. We've worked with over 30 authors and researchers to systematically search the evidence base in response to 8 key questions, which relate to humanitarian interventions and approaches. This work has critically appraised and synthesized around 250 individual pieces of research, academic as well as gray literature, such as program reports and evaluations. What does this do? This has provided a synthesis of the best available research evidence on the influence and impact of key humanitarian approaches and interventions, i.e., what works. Also, this has led us to see a very clear picture of where the evidence gaps are, and we have some recommendations about potential ways to address these. The outputs of this work were published in the form of 8 systematic reviews and evidence briefs earlier this year. Today, this is the third in our series of 4 webinars that we're holding this month. Today's topic is understanding practices for identifying and reaching vulnerable populations in crises, with a specific focus on urban humanitarian action and shelter in humanitarian emergencies. Today, we are delighted to be joined on our panel by Ronak Patel, a co-author of the Urban Humanitarian Action Evidence Synthesis and Director of Urbanization and Resilience Program at the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative. Welcome to Ronak. And we're also joined by Elizabeth Parker, who's an independent consultant and co-author of the Shelter Evidence Synthesis. Thank you so much for joining us. Today, we also welcome Lucy Earle, who's the Urban Advisor for DFID's Humanitarian Policy and Partnerships Group. Lucy is our discussant and will help contextualize some of the findings and implications. Welcome to Lucy. And everyone who's online now should be able to see on their screen the bios and photos of our 3 members today. So we'll set the stage for the discussion by hearing briefly about the context and findings of the 2 reviews before moving on to a group discussion. Ronak, over to you to share the key findings from the Urban Evidence Synthesis.
Thank you, Liz. We framed our systematic review to answer the question, what are the practices to identify and prioritize vulnerable populations affected by urban humanitarian emergencies. In essence, how do you target your humanitarian programs towards the most in need during an urban crisis? And we chose this simply because humanitarians are now finding themselves increasingly working in urban areas. This is due to a multitude of reasons. Most of humanity, over 50%, now lives in cities and towns. In addition, cities now concentrate a lot of the risks and hazards to crises. And finally, people that are displaced are often displaced now into urban areas. So over 50% of refugees find themselves now living in cities. But the vulnerability and needs of these populations are very complex and multi-sectoral. They're not as straightforward or easily delineated as one type of need in a camp or rural setting. Often they mix with each other, such that the security environment for a woman in an urban slum dictates her access to basic goods and services. And so figuring out what vulnerability looks like is much more complex. Additionally, recent crises in Kathmandu, Port-au-Prince, and other urban areas have highlighted the failings of using typical approaches and standard methodologies for identifying the most vulnerable, leading to inefficient aid and missing sometimes the most vulnerable populations. And using universal standards such as sphere standards or others that try to put down one type of baseline doesn't often work in these rapidly growing cities, where we found through our own research that many populations live in extreme poverty, often well below the sphere minimum standards. And so something more specific is needed for these cities. Finally, we thought that possibly the things that we would find through this review would have complementarity to work in the pre-disaster phase for identifying and targeting populations for preparedness work, as well as the recovery and even social protection phase of development. Next slide, please. What we did find through our study profile was a few things. We started with a very broad search. We searched for any vulnerability and assessment or targeting that was exercised in an urban humanitarian crisis and evaluated by any means, both in the academic and gray literature. Now, coming from a medical background, this is unusual. I've done a couple systematic reviews there before, and those are more typically geared towards very narrowly defined questions and relegated just to the academic literature, where you have a certain level of rigor and quality of the studies, often very controlled trials. But we had to remain very broad to collect everything within the humanitarian literature. We found over 29,000 titles reviewed, finally 304 for full text review using our selection criteria, and finally included 19 articles. 14 were gray literature, 5 were academic, and most were qualitative. It's interesting to note that all 19 were published after 1999, even though we searched all the way up to 1985, and 15 of them after 2010, which makes sense given that we are finding ourselves, like I said, in urban areas more as humanitarians, and we're tending to do more study of our own practices now. Now, these limitations of this review and the findings apply to most systematic reviews in the space, and that is, this search is a limitation due to the state of the humanitarian literature. How it's produced, published, cataloged, and consolidated is not very systematic. There aren't easily searchable databases with specific search terms, and we find ourselves looking through a number of websites, agencies, donors, think tanks to collect all of the gray literature. Of note, we did not broaden the scope to development practice or poverty alleviation literature that could have very well had a good insights for our research question. We wanted to stay true to practices that had actually been implemented in humanitarian crises. Next slide, please. The evidence base was thin, but we did find a few things to note. First, targeting by displacement status, whether you were a refugee or whether you were internally displaced within an urban area, wasn't necessarily the way to find the most vulnerable populations. As we said, many urban populations lived well below the sphere minimum standards even before our crisis, and using just displacement didn't necessarily mean that you were targeting the most vulnerable that was affected by a crisis in an urban area. Similarly, targeting by categorical definitions, such as demographic features, using certain assumptions that normally hold true, like women and children being the most vulnerable, often works, but it does sometimes miss things. And so, for example, Iraqi men that were unaccompanied minor refugees within Syria in the early 2000s happen to show a high degree of vulnerability. And so these need to be made context specific. Urban areas also give you the possibility of using pre-existing data, city municipal data, census data, other NGOs that have been working in the field, but often these can be out of date, non-representative, and even biased. They often don't penetrate into the urban slums where the urban poor live and where you'd find your most vulnerable. And so the first thing that needs to happen is to figure out how you can supplement that data to make it whole. Next slide, please. Our strongest data and evidence came from using locally derived tools, either de novo tools and assessments that were made for that specific city in context of crisis, or adapted tools from another crisis. I'll get to that more later. Self-targeting, whereby persons and individuals identify themselves for a specific program or service, seemed to work, but it is something that showed was difficult to maintain in the long term, transition to local authorities, and often missed some of the most vulnerable that didn't want to identify themselves. Often people sought urban areas for anonymity, think urban refugees. Similarly, community-based targeting, where you use the community to find its own vulnerable populations, can often be very fraught. You have to understand the local power dynamics, reasons and motivations for participating, and you want to make sure that you don't get co-opted into those power dynamics and reinforce certain types of vulnerability and oppression by using community-based targeting. Finally, any quantitative methods that uses surveys, cluster randomized samples, such as that, needs to have larger sample sizes, more clusters, or even smaller geographic units to make sure that pockets of vulnerability and diversity in such dense heterogeneous settings as cities is not missed. Back to you, Liz.
Great, thank you very much, Rona. We'll now turn to Elizabeth, who will present the key findings from the shelter evidence synthesis.
Thank you very much, Liz. So today I'll be presenting our shelter self-recovery evidence synthesis. This synthesis represents the first ever attempt to apply systematic review methodology to an assessment of the evidence surrounding humanitarian shelter and settlement interventions. Specifically, it sets out to respond to two main research questions that are the top 2 points on this slide. First is around outcomes. What effects do interventions that support affected populations' own shelter self-recovery processes have on household level outcomes following humanitarian crises? And secondly, what factors helped or hindered the implementation of interventions supporting populations' own shelter self-recovery processes following humanitarian crises? These questions were developed through a comprehensive twofold scoping stage. First, we engaged a wide range of stakeholders through email, personal communication, an online survey and presentations at key sector events to understand which topics or areas there was demand. And secondly, we mapped the breadth, depth and nature of documents available. We took this two-pronged approach so that we could be confident that the area we focused on, focused our research on, was both of interest to the shelter sector and also that there was adequate documents available so that we had something to synthesize at the end and we didn't have an empty review. Through this process, we arrived at our review of shelter self-recovery. It's long been recognised that housing is an incremental process as well as a noun, and in recent years, especially with increasing numbers of complex urban crises, there's a greater focus on supporting rather than delivering housing. In fact, the term self-recovery in the shelter sector seems to have first been used in response to Cyclone Cedar in 2007 in Bangladesh, and then over the next couple of years in responses to crises in South and Southeast Asia, with it being widely used following Typhoon Haiyan in 2013, where it was a strategic objective of the shelter cluster, as it also was in South Sudan in 2013 and Nepal in 2015. However, you won't be surprised to hear that there was no clear definition. So through analysis of documents capturing interventions described as shelter self-recovery, we defined it in our research as, this is the 3 bullet points at the bottom on the slide here, interventions which provided one or a combination of either material assistance, including construction materials, tools, salvaged materials and debris, or financial assistance, both cash and vouchers, and technical assistance, including training, on-site monitoring, guidance through guidelines or mass communication such as posters or websites, etc. And the result of these various assistance methods resulted in the construction of a shelter. Next slide, please. So our systematic review followed the 5-step process, which is set out here on the slide. Step 1 was we wrote the research protocol. A research protocol for a systematic review is really just the methodology. It sets out what you're going to do, how you're going to do your research. This went through a comprehensive peer review and included information about the eligibility criteria for the documents we would include in our review, the quality appraisal method, and the websites and libraries that we would search. In particular, the quality appraisal bar, which is step 4 here, was set very low, as we really didn't want to exclude many or even any documents on quality, as we knew from the initial scoping study that this would likely result in an empty synthesis. So this is really in contrast to the majority of systematic reviews, where the bar set really high and you're trying to get the best quality information available, and that's really why we have been referring to, and I hope I do consistently throughout this presentation, refer to our systematic review as an evidence synthesis. Step 2, we ran the search terms, identifying over 4,500 documents and screening them, mostly for relevance, using the titles of abstracts. This brought us down to 102 documents. Then we screened the full text of these 102 documents for relevance and adequate detail, resulting in 15 that remained eligible. The 4th step, as I've mentioned, was to assess the quality, after which we excluded 4, leaving 11 documents included in our review for data extraction and synthesis. So of these 11 documents, it was interesting hearing Ronak's breakdown. It's not too dissimilar from ours. Ours were slightly later, with all being published between 2005 and 2015. Our document identification was completed in early 2016, so we got some quite up-to-date documents. 8 of the studies we included were mixed methods, and 3 were just qualitative. Also, interestingly, the majority of the studies were evaluations or impact assessments of individual programs. This was 9 of the 11. Of the remaining 2, 1 was a large-scale research study commissioned by the Norwegian Refugee Council on a multi-donor response in Lebanon, and only 1 came from academia. There was significant variation in the quality of the included documents, also as Ronak mentioned for his review, but across the board there was there really is a significant risk of bias through all 11 documents in either the data collection, analysis, or researcher role. Next slide, please. So the interventions that we included, the bit of a snapshot on this slide, they were primarily located in Asia, the Middle East, South and Central America. 1 was in Europe and none were in Africa. Two programs only provided financial assistance. You can see this in both pie diagrams. 2 programs only provided financial assistance, 5 provided financial and technical assistance, 2 provided material and technical assistance, and the remaining 2 provided all 3 forms of assistance. So there's quite a lot of variation across the board. If you look at the image on the left, you can see 5 were in response to rapid onset natural disasters, and 6 were in response to complex crises. And the image on the right also illustrates the diversity of the programs that we included in our review, in that the households, once they've received the agency support, took different pathways. Some repaired and rebuilt their existing houses, some built transitional shelter, and some built core homes. Next slide, please. So coming on to our key findings. So this was our first question around effects and outcomes. What effects do these interventions have on populations, own self-recovery processes? And so the short answer to this question is we still don't really know. And this is something that after all this work, we're really disappointed not to be able to draw stronger conclusions, because we're really asking, did we make things better? And that's a fundamental question. We can be fairly confident about the first 2 outcomes around improved household dignity and self-reliance. That was very positive, and also around household perception of safety from natural hazards and security from crime and violence. However, the final 4 outcomes listed here on the slide do require additional research, especially because, as well as limited data, some of the data available was contradictory. So, for example, some of the documents reported that the interventions had positive effects and others reported negative effects. So, for example, effect 4 around household assets and debts. 2 studies reported positive effects and 3 reported negative. So there needs to be more unpacking there. Next slide, please. So this is the second question that our research sought to address around which factors helped or hindered the implementation of interventions. And so the short answer to this question is a lot of factors. Across the documents, 16 different factors were identified, and these were grouped into 3 areas. The column on the left details the household factor, in the middle the programme factor, and on the right-hand side the context factors. So these are really useful categories to consider when designing and implementing a shelter self-recovery programme. In particular, the programme factors really speak to good programme management, and the context and household factors should form the backbone of initial assessments and subsequent risk management. So yeah, that's our review. Back to you, Liz. Thank you.
Hello. Sorry, there was a slight muting problem there. Thank you so much for this great discussion of your findings. Really interesting and a lot to discuss here. I'll now turn to Lucy, who will contextualize some of these findings for us and discuss their implications for practitioners. Lucy, can you hear us? I think you might still be muted.
Can you hear me now?
We can hear you now. Yep, great.
Great. So yes, thank you so much, Liz, and thank you also to Ronak and to Elizabeth for presenting their work and to their teams, and to say what a fantastic job they've done. It's really quite a task to go through quite so many documents, and perhaps difficult as a researcher to end up with so few to talk about at the end. But nevertheless, I think these reviews have, although they don't perhaps come up with anything particularly surprising, they certainly give us sort of stronger ground and more confidence to talk about some of these issues. I think what struck me from the urban review, and which I think is very, very important, is this issue around the status-based targeting, that there are problems with that. If you just target according to refugee or displaced status, you're missing out a number of people with considerable vulnerability in urban areas, host communities, etc. The stress that researchers talk about looking for socio-economic indicators of vulnerability. They're warning that we should avoid sector-based programming, and the importance of context, understanding the context and informing our work with local insights. And I found it very interesting also that researchers looked for literature that considered absorptive capacity of urban areas. So I'm not sure Ronak mentioned this, but looking at whether there was any literature that considered how urban areas, the systems that exist in urban areas, the services, how they can be best used to support vulnerable populations, so avoiding setting up new and parallel systems of support. And something that struck me from this work is the echoes that it has of DFID's new humanitarian policy that was launched just last Friday, which repeats this idea that we need to move away from assessments that are focused on status, on refugee status or displaced status. And it repeats calls from the Grand Bargain, which was an agreement reached after the World Humanitarian Summit last year that has a number of ideas for improving humanitarian response, but it stresses that needs assessments must be impartial and that we need to be working with local and national systems. So these various documents, to me, what they seem to be saying is that the logical next step for us, if we're going to be working in urban areas and trying to identify and prioritize vulnerable populations, is to move towards assessments that are area-based, which would be where instead of looking specifically for individuals with particular characteristics, you start off by considering a geographical area within the city, and then you look at the vulnerabilities of the whole population and their capacities as well. And you look at what services, goods, infrastructure are available within it and how to work with those. And this move towards area-based is something that I'm beginning to hear more and more talk about it. And I'm wondering if moving towards an area-based assessment in urban humanitarian crisis is perhaps a way to make sure that our responses are based on demand rather than supply. And something that was struck by Ronak and his colleagues' review was that quite often it seemed that people had hammers and were looking for nails. So they had a certain types of goods or services they wanted to give out in this response, and they're looking for the most appropriate people to give that to, rather than looking first at the context and how people were vulnerable within that context, and then tailoring a response to them. It's possible that I'm seeing sort of area-based approaches everywhere, but maybe because I'm about to go and join an event that's happening in the room next to where I'm sitting, which is precisely around area-based approaches in urban areas. But I think that's perhaps the direction that we're moving in. And then just on the shelter review, I think when I read that, I read it second, and I expected to see some overlap with the urban review, but actually there are a very limited number of studies from the shelter review that considered urban or peri-urban environments. But still there were some similar broad findings. And something that stood out for me was the researchers basically saying that given the scale of need around shelter, you really won't be able to meet that need if you come to a response with ready-made products. You have to work with what's there, with people's ability to build their own homes or repair their own homes, with existing markets for labour and for materials. So again, for this, you need to understand the context. And in cities, when you're working on shelter self-recovery, you have to understand urban systems and the way that people interact with their environments to access shelter. And something that I noticed from the review is that no documents on Haiti ended up in the review on shelter. And I was, I suppose, initially a little bit surprised given the huge amounts of funding that was spent after the earthquake in 2010 on shelter. But then speaking to one of the other authors of the review yesterday, to Victoria Maynard, she reminded me that actually shelter self-recovery programs were not widely used in the Haiti response. And I think that's quite telling, because a lot of the criticism afterwards of that response in terms of shelter was that there were huge areas of Port-au-Prince that were newly occupied after the earthquake by people whose homes had been destroyed. And they built their own homes, hundreds of thousands of people, largely without any technical support or any site planning. And this is actually, I think, really built in new or reinforced existing vulnerabilities to climate change, to earthquakes, and other daily hazards. So it occurs to me that that's sort of quite a telling, it's not an omission from the review, but that this shows that perhaps there's more to be learned about where we can apply shelter self-recovery programs. And it was interesting that so many in the shelter sector asked researchers to focus on this. And just to end, a lesson perhaps for donors, one of the other important findings, I think, from the shelter review was how the context can change during a shelter recovery program, and that inflation or lack of materials, or in fact large numbers of people who aren't able to rebuild or repair their own homes, may hinder their ability to engage with the program. So I suppose what I take from this is that not only do you have to understand the context before you start a program, but you have to understand how that context may change. And I think that's an important lesson for donors to take on board, that when we're considering funding shelter programs at the start of an emergency, we must build in some flexibilities and contingency to make sure that we actually reach our goals with that program. Thank you, Liz.
Great, thank you so much, Lucy. That really gave us some great context and some things to think about as we move forward in our discussion. So the way we'll start is that I'll ask a few questions, and then we'll start to collate questions from the online audience, which will then be posed to the specific panelists. So a key theme of the Humanitarian Evidence Program has been to synthesize the existing evidence. And this is not only for use in future research or academia, but also, and more importantly, to inform the work of practitioners on the ground in humanitarian crises. So in that regard, I'd like to hear from each of the two teams, what are some illustrations based on everything you looked at of good practice or successful interventions in each of the two fields that you examined, based on your evidence synthesis specifically? And Elizabeth, we'll start with you.
Hi, Liz. Thank you very much. If you wouldn't mind going to the last slide that I presented, our second research question, which sought to really address this question precisely. Thank you very much. So in particular, I'd like to highlight the importance of the column on the left, the household factors, the ability of households to contribute skills, labours, materials and finance. We found pardon me, the more a household could contribute, the more this helped in implementation for a number of reasons. For example, it made up the shortfall of additional costs that were not anticipated at the beginning of a programme. It prevented delays as people could buy materials when they were available with their own funds rather than waiting for the agency distribution of funds, which in some cases was slow. They could save money on labourers by doing unskilled work themselves, and they could hire skilled labourers to improve the quality of the shelter if they themselves didn't have the skills or the time to do so. So all of these were effectively mitigating the risks of the context factors shown here on the column on the right. However, this was a significant disadvantage for vulnerable households who were typically less able to contribute. So this resulted for the most vulnerable households in greater delays in construction process, lower quality shelter, increased household level debt and increased costs associated with paying for additional labour, as they, for example, were less able to shop around to access the best value materials. So really this is compounding the vulnerability that was existing. So in this instance, there are a number of good example practices that emerged. So firstly, the good project management approaches that are noted here in the central column, in particular, number 1, undertaking assessments and regular monitoring, especially of the context factors that hinder, which are noted in the column on the right around inflation, corruption, availability of labour, etc. This coupled with number 3, which talks to flexible programming to support changing needs, underpins number 6, which is delivering adequate financial, technical and material assistance, especially to the most vulnerable. As self-recovery programs transfer a lot of risk to households, having adequate contingency, and I think this is something that Lucy just touched on, having an adequate contingency money available in the event of significant context change, such as a change in government policy or rapid inflation. This contingency funding can be used by the agency or distributed to households to cover increased costs. Some of the programs that we included, as a result of changing context factors, they were required to give additional, they called them top-up grants or top-up funding to households, but it was done on a reactive basis rather than a proactive basis. So it was kind of done later down the line, and it caused complications. In one instance, they had to redo the beneficiary selection process. So just having this contingency and also how you're going to use it, thought through at the beginning, would help. A second example of good practice is that some of the documents reported that they grouped households into clusters, including vulnerable households. So, for example, clusters of 8 or 10 households with 1 or 2 vulnerable households, and they tied payment of the next tranche of funding to completion to a certain level by all households. So, for example, to completion of the foundation, completion up to wall height, or completion of the roof. This is reported to have been successful, as it meant more vulnerable households were not left behind, but it does also have some disadvantages of its own. And the final example of good practice really talks to programme factor number 2 around designing a clear and simple plan, where different support is provided to different households depending on their need. So, for example, more vulnerable families who are not able to contribute their own labour, materials or finance are simply given additional support. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Now we're going to go over to Ronak. What has your own evidence synthesis revealed regarding good practice?
Thank you, Liz. As we've said, the evidence that we found was very little in quantity and very low in quality. So it's hard to make very strong recommendations that are evidence-based for good practice, but there are a few. The number one thing that I'll say, it goes back to our findings. The strongest evidence we found, and Lucy reiterated this, is that things that leverage local knowledge and a nuanced understanding of these contexts and communities are the best. They necessarily invite all of the representation from this population, looking at things like how people get their needs met, what coping strategies are used, incorporating those things into a needs assessment and targeting strategy will likely get you the best type of targeting. And by best, again, we were looking at things that had the most accuracy and precision. At the same time, the second point I'll make is that while we are looking for that best accuracy and best precision for needs assessments, vulnerability assessments, or targeting, however you want to call that term, this has to be balanced with your goals. What are the goals of this humanitarian program, project, intervention? And often those types of high accuracy, high precision, locally derived de novo scales take a lot of time and resources. They may not be the most appropriate methodology to use. And so there isn't likely one best targeting methodology or one best vulnerability assessment for specific situations. It depends on the goals and needs of that program. And so in initial 2 weeks, you may lose a lot of lives trying to get the best, most accurate socioeconomic, locally derived scale, when another method that may not be as good and as accurate or precise will still allow you to do a lot of good. And so those, there's a little bit of tension between those two practices, but need to be understood and balanced as you approach humanitarian crises in urban areas. Finally, I'll reiterate the thing that Lucy also said. It's fortunate and unfortunate that I think we think very similarly on this, that a lot of the evidence we found and a lot of programs currently are geared as hammers looking for nails. So when we looked for targeting or vulnerability assessment, it was all in regards to what we as an organization were providing and finding the most needy for that specific thing. But understanding vulnerability and needs of urban populations requires us to understand how urban lives are lived, how cities function, how people get their basic goods and needs met. And that will actually get to understanding how you should actually target your programs. It'll lead to better design programs if your needs assessment and targeting is based on that type of understanding. Lucy mentioned area-based programming and things like settlement-based approaches. I think those hold a lot of promise as these more demand-driven methodologies that will hopefully alter our practice towards assessment and tools in a similar vein. We weren't allowed to say a lot based on the evidence that we found in the synthesis. And so as an author group, we published a separate commentary on our systematic review findings that was just published last week in PLOS Currents Disasters. That is a kind of expert commentary on these findings, as well as several other papers that didn't meet the criteria as evidence-based literature, but still informed possible practice going forward. And so if you're interested in more of that, you can look up that paper. Thank you, Liz, back to you.
Great, thank you so much. This has been really a fascinating way to kick off and gives us a lot of food for thought. One of the themes that I'm hearing has to do with how we collect data throughout the crisis, and what type of data we need in order to be able to improve evidence synthesis and what we can learn from interventions. So when we think about this, based on all the reviews and synthesis and searches that your teams did, how can we improve data? What data can governments, humanitarian agencies, and others collect before, during, and after a crisis that can improve humanitarian response in these two areas? Ronak, we'll start with you.
Thank you, Liz. As a research nerd, I love this question. What we found is something I'll emphasize from our findings, which is, the value of pre-existing data in urban areas holds a lot of promise. These are areas in which there are local governments and authorities responsible for these populations in the development phase as well as in the pre-disaster phase. And so at the very basic level, just accurate population estimates and demographics would be incredibly valuable. Unfortunately, a lot of city municipal data as well as census data can be completely out of date, sometimes often by years. And cities, especially rapidly growing ones where we find ourselves working, are very dynamic. They change, they're fluid. And having much more up-to-date population estimates and demographics would be very valuable. Also, that these data are more granular. I think often we find a lot of data that is aggregate about cities, and there's one metric about the health status in this specific indicator for the entire city. But it's not broken down by the heterogeneity and diversity that we see within cities. And so things that are more granular along these demographic variables and socioeconomic metrics would go a long way towards helping design programs and coming up with those initial vulnerability assessments and targeting methodologies. Finally, I'll say maps, maps, and more maps. Vulnerability in urban areas is spatial. These urban areas, especially on the margins where the urban poor live, flux and flow in dynamic ways, and especially after a crisis. And so having accurate maps of these areas, or at least up-to-date maps before the crisis or acute crisis, helps a lot and goes a long way for practitioners to target programs and come up with vulnerability assessments and tools. Thank you. Back to you, Liz.
Great, thank you so much, Ronak. Elizabeth, over to you. What has your evidence synthesis shown regarding data and how to improve the data we collect to improve response throughout the life cycle of crises?
Thank you very much. So through the evidence synthesis of evaluations, there's the temptation to report that we really do need to be collecting all of the data all of the time, because that's just the nature of consolidating reflections. You have the wonder of hindsight, but of course it's not practical or desirable to recommend constant data collection of everything. So when we've been reflecting on this question, our recommendation really is to be as clear about, to be as clear as possible as you can about what you need the data for. So in our minds, really, there's two clear data sets around outcomes. What outcomes are you measuring? And also around program data to track progress and, of course, course correct if the program's not on track. So this would likely take the form of needs assessment, market assessments, environmental impact assessments, risk assessments, health and safety assessments to prevent injuries during the construction process, which is being led by either households themselves, etc. And of course, both data sets are available and critical for program design. Through the course of our research, we developed a theory of change for shelter self-recovery programs. And if you wouldn't mind flicking to slide number 20, it's got a bit of a flow diagram on. Yes, that's the one, perfect. We needed to develop this because there was great diversity between the documents included in our review as to what was an input, an output, and an outcome. So in order to compare them, we needed to have a consistent framework. Typically, the outputs of shelter interventions are reported as the number of products delivered or services completed by the implementing agency. For example, the number of trainings delivered, the number of CGI sheets delivered, that sort of thing. But what developing this theory of change highlighted is that these items that are reported as outputs, typically in shelter programs, are in fact inputs to the shelter self-recovery process. The process, as in the activities, are managed or undertaken by the households themselves, and as such, the agencies have much less control, but through their inputs do have significant influence on this process. And if we move on to the next slide, there's two, if that's okay. Yeah, perfect. If we move on to the next slide, you can see the logic of this when you compare a self-recovery program with an agency or contractor build program. The comparison of the inputs, the comparison of the activities, outputs, outcomes, etc. So to conclude, in terms of data collection, we recommend being really precise about what data you're collecting, what for, and how you're going to use it. And hopefully this theory of change framework will be helpful for others implementing shelter self-recovery programs. Thank you. Over to you, Liz.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So the last question was really looking at the data and how to improve the data and what we need to be thinking about through the life cycle of a crisis in regard to the data. What I want to turn to next is more specifically the gaps. So we know that the evidence in some of these topics has been thin or weak. Where do we see the gaps in what we expected to see and did not find? And how does this point to the possibility for future evidence generation about what we should be collecting in the field, and importantly, what we need to know as practitioners, donors, policymakers, and academics thinking about doing this work? Elizabeth, we'll start with you for this one.
Thank you. So our evidence synthesis identified a number of key areas for further research or investigation. A couple are bulleted on this slide here. First, with a focus on shelter self-recovery programs, we really would recommend further research on both outcomes and processes as valuable. Also picking up from the household factor that had the biggest impact on program success, the ability of households and communities to contribute skills, labour, materials or finance. There's significant gaps around the how, as in how do you best assess this, who's assessing this, how are you assessing, and then tracking it through the programme so that any contextual changes are also captured, what approaches are most effective and what pitfalls to look out for. So that's the first 2 bullet points here. Secondly, as we noted earlier, through our research, we concluded that the majority of documents that contained adequate detail on process and outcomes were largely evaluations or studies commissioned by humanitarian agencies or donors themselves. In our sector, it seems there's very few academic pieces of research that look at individual interventions, rather they look at an area or a community or a village or a countrywide response. Whilst this has advantages and disadvantages, the main advantage is that we as a community are the ones commissioning, undertaking and funding this research. So we do have the control, very much in our hands to improve the quality of the evaluations and the data that we collect. So with a focus on improving the quality of primary data collection and evaluations, we recommend that looking at how we commission evaluations would be a valuable area of research as well, so that individuals or teams commissioning evaluations are really setting the bar high enough. So, for example, investigating the factors that help or hinder the process of commissioning and learning from humanitarian evaluations, and also making that practical and providing guidance and or training on applying appropriate study designs, evaluations, frameworks and indicators, such as a template terms of reference for shelter evaluations. And finally, it's not all doom and gloom. There is some good evidence out there and some great evidence, in fact, but it's very scattered. I think Ronak mentioned this as well, and it's kind of hidden everywhere. And in our systematic reviews, we really did look under every stone, and we're grabbing people and asking them to give us documents off their hard drives and things like that. But that's not always practical. We were able to do that because we were doing this research, but really, for the evidence to be accessible, it needs to be in one place. So, through the course of our research, we found that the LNAP Humanitarian and Evaluation and Learning Portal, which is called HELP appropriately, was to be one of the best repositories of evaluations. And we would really urge agencies or donors, anyone online who has an evaluation, please upload it, and please set in place an automatic process so that when you commission evaluations and you have one available, it automatically gets uploaded. That would be, if after listening to this webinar, that's the one action you do when you leave, that would be absolutely fantastic. You'd have very many grateful researchers. So thank you, Liz.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. Ronak, over to you to talk a bit about the gap.
Thank you, Liz. So the gap is still wide. As I said, even with the findings we found, they were low in quantity and low in quality. And so, as a physician, I couldn't even ethically say that I am applying evidence-based practice using the findings that we had even in our systematic review, because it was so little. And so it's hard to say this, but all of this still needs a lot more evidence. Even using locally derived tools and scales, still needs to be a lot of work done on that. But there were a few specific areas where we found absolutely nothing, which is interesting. Evidence from conflict zones or conflict-afflicted urban areas was completely missing. There was nothing there. And beyond food security, a lot of sector-specific study was missing. Maybe that's appropriate. As we said, in urban areas, needs are multi-sectoral, and so we should get away from thinking about sector-specific needs assessment, but it's still interesting that food was there and others were not. The use of beneficiary-generated data, such as crowdsourcing or big data, we thought that might come up given it's been highlighted so often and even seen as a strength of urban areas that have a lot of pre-existing data, but we found nothing on using those tools, that type of data, into needs assessments or targeting tools. We also found nothing between linking these types of targeting methodologies during a crisis to the same type of processes that would be used in a preparedness stage or a social protection program, for instance. You could imagine a lot of the programs that humanitarians might employ during a crisis could be transitioned into social protection programs later. But we found nothing that discussed the similarity between approaches and tools between different phases of these disaster cycle. Finally, I'll go back to something that Lucy had said, in that we didn't try to necessarily exclude certain things, but the fact that we didn't find them was telling. Things like this absorptive capacity that Lucy mentioned is a very big feature of urban areas. It goes back to understanding how urban systems work and lives are lived. For example, what is the capacity to host populations rather than provide temporary shelter? That's a critical thing that we should probably have an assessment tool to understand, yet we did not find anything on that. Similarly, from the health field, what's the absorptive capacity of the remaining health infrastructure? How do you assess that in an urban area to know what kind of resources may be needed or need to be supplemented? Nothing on that either. Not that we excluded that from our search terms. If you look at the full review, they just didn't come up. And so it's interesting that a lot of our programmatic design that will be coming up, I think, in urban response didn't find its way into the study of assessment tools or targeting methodologies. Back to you, Liz.
Great, thank you so much, Ronak. We'll now ask Lucy Earle from DFID to comment on some of these topics and issues that have come up having to do with identified opportunities for research and how can we close some of the gaps in the evidence base.
Thanks, Liz. Yeah, I was really struck by quite how few studies ended up in each review, and I have to say this must have been, in a way, a bit of a depressing exercise for the researchers to have nearly 30,000 texts but then end up with only 19 that were of decent quality. Must have been, yeah, it was slightly demoralizing. I suppose it's quite important to know that one of these documents is a systematic review, but the other one couldn't be a systematic review. It had to be an evidence synthesis, because if the same level of rigor had been applied to the documents found through the shelter search, there would have been almost nothing left, the empty review that Elizabeth spoke about. And I think also very telling from the shelter review was comments from the authors on the very poor quality of evaluations and the documentations they found. So even basic information on programs was missing around who it reached, how many people, and the cost of the program. And also, this other point made by Elizabeth, there was such a focus on the process of providing shelter rather than the outcomes and the impact. So this leads me to think there's some serious lessons here for DFID and for other donors. And perhaps this will be one of the legacies of the Humanitarian Evidence Program, that we've applied this systematic review method to the evidence, but perhaps we're not ready to be using this method to look at the evidence that's come out of the humanitarian world. Perhaps there just isn't enough yet. And I think we need to take this back to DFID and other donors and really start insisting on research components in programming, or insisting on budgets for evaluation. And obviously that's evaluation is difficult because it happens after the end of a program. But I think we need to start thinking about that more when we start programming, thinking about when we would expect to see some impacts of our work and budget for that. And like I said, I think this ought to be a legacy of this work that DFID has been funding with Oxfam and Feinstein. We're, as an organisation, a few years ago, we began this quite concerted push to improve the quality and quantity of evidence in the humanitarian sector. And I think what this program has done is demonstrated quite how little there is. And I think if we're serious about value for money, we have to know what our investments are producing. So that was just what I wanted to say, apart from also gold star for ALNAP for their fantastic databases, and also to point out there's a really good urban response portal as well, which has a great deal of documentation on urban in it. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. We are now going to go straight to some of the questions from the panelists online. So we're getting quite a number of questions having to do with markets in the evidence synthesis. What role do you see that these have played? Ronak, we'll start with you.
So markets have been highlighted as we're getting questions from this as a very powerful tool in urban areas. You know, most people get their needs, very basic needs, even healthcare, sometimes in urban slums, water, electricity, public services that we think of as public goods from markets. And so understanding markets and how people would be getting their needs, how they're disrupted by crises, and how they can be recovered or rehabilitated is critical. But it's also, as I said, interesting to note that we found nothing on understanding those for needs assessment purposes, going again back to the fact that these are hammers looking for nails. And so what we wanted to do was emphasize that the point I made about understanding how urban lives are lived, how people get their needs met, is critical to defining how you develop the appropriate targeting and assessment tools. Now, there's a lot of work being done by others, CALP, notably on looking at market assessment tools. These didn't make it into our search criteria because they weren't looking at the vulnerability or targeting of specific populations, communities, and individuals and households, but it's still something that falls into the realm of urban assessments, urban targeting. And so there could be a smaller review of those practices. I think the numbers would still be small to look at, and the evidence base would still be thin in actually looking at how they've been implemented and how successful they were. Additionally, I think our efforts in market approaches have heavily been on the demand side, putting in cash interventions, vouchers, and such to spur demand from local markets, and less so developed on the supply side in understanding how these markets actually deliver their goods and services, what kind of logistics, wholesale, transport networks are needed, and interventions to improve those, because humanitarians still focus on the other side. But I think that is developing, and a similar review of this could find some very valuable insights, but I would suspect that we still need more time for actual evidence, testing and trialing of these tools and methodologies to find conclusions that we can actually use. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Elizabeth, do you want to make any comments on markets?
Hi, yes, thank you. Yeah, we found that market economic recovery was unsurprisingly a key factor in success of shelter self-recovery programs. This was really important, especially for programs that provided only technical and financial assistance, because of course the households themselves were going directly to the markets in order to buy the materials. Interestingly, where in the initial stages of the program, inflation had been noted as a significant risk. That was why the decision was made by the program delivery organisations to actually to provide material assistance instead, because of the increased rate of inflation following the crisis. They couldn't be confident that that cost wouldn't be passed on to the households, so they themselves provided the materials. In some cases, the rates of inflation were really significant. So, for example, there was a program that was included in our review in Lebanon, the one that I mentioned previously, and the price of steel doubled during the program during the program implementation. There was also another program in Sri Lanka which required the agencies to provide top-up grants that I also mentioned. And so these high rates of inflation really hindered program implementation. They increased prices for the households, they increased prices for the agencies themselves, and what this meant really was that quality was reduced of the final shelters because all the money that was available had to be used to buy the materials rather than, for example, for more skilled labour or to put in better drainage or other areas. So that was really that was what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much. Lucy, did you want to add anything related to markets?
Yes, thanks. Just very briefly, something occurred to me that could be an interesting piece of future research on markets would be to look at whether this issue of self-recovery and availability of goods and labour on the markets, whether there's any significant difference between that in urban and rural areas. So as the research have shown, there's very few studies that look specifically at self-recovery in urban areas. I'm not really sure why that would be, and I think perhaps some further investigation of what the opportunities or challenges for that kind of approach to shelter in urban areas would be very welcome and could perhaps lead to some useful guidance. Also, on the issue of guidance and tools, there's some interesting work that a number of agencies are doing, some of it with DFID funding, on context analysis, so improving our understanding of the context. So not just understanding local markets, but also understanding local governance systems. And I think crucially also beginning to think about land tenure and availability of land and some of the restrictions around using land after a crisis for building housing. And actually that was one of the evidence gaps that I was surprised by in the shelter review. I was surprised that more didn't come up on this issue of land tenure, which, as far as I'm aware, has been a big barrier to shelter programs, and I think possibly particularly in urban areas where land is of greater value and where it's perhaps more likely to be privately owned. Maybe that's an assumption on my part, but there's certainly often more sort of political interest in urban land, which might prevent people from being able to use it for relocating populations affected by crises. And one other thing I wanted just to say, respond to something Ronak said earlier, when he was talking about having accurate maps, and that in urban areas vulnerability is sort of spatial. I'd say that often in some of these areas where the most vulnerable live, they're not actually mapped, and for a reason, for political reasons, that these populations living in informal settlements where land tenure is not fully, where they don't necessarily have legal tenure, and where there may be contestation over rights to remain on that land, often these populations aren't mapped at all, and there's resistance to that. But then again, perhaps if we start thinking more spatially around our responses in the cities and start using maps more to identify populations, this could also be a legacy for our work in cities in terms of getting populations, vulnerable populations, recognised by city authorities. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Lucy, for those great points. Our next question from the audience, we're going to pose to Elizabeth. We're getting some questions on the extent to which hazard-resistant materials showed up in the shelter self-recovery evidence base. Does your review show anything about hazard-resistant materials in use?
Hi there, thank you, Liz. Hazard-resistant materials. So I trained originally as an architect and spent a while practicing both in the UK and in South America. And I would always say there are no hazard-resistant materials. There's really no such thing. It's how you use the materials that you have, whether that's concrete or unfired earth or timber, how you use them, the details that you put those materials together, the quality of construction. That's really key, rather than just the materials themselves. In terms of how the variety of materials that the shelters that were included in our review were made of was quite diverse. Primarily, though, it was timber and CGI, corrugated iron, the sort of crinkly sheet metal that you can see often used in low-cost construction. Sometimes it was cement blocks. But our second outcome that I touched on earlier did focus on perceptions of households, whether they perceived following the intervention their houses were safer or less safe to natural hazards or secure from crime and violence. And as I mentioned earlier, that the process of the intervention did have a positive effect on, I think, around 7 of the interventions. They perceived that their houses were safer, and they perceived that they were less exposed and less vulnerable. So that is a positive, but it wasn't necessarily just the materials. It was the manner of construction and everything that goes along with that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Our next question is for Ronak. Ronak, there is great variation from one urban environment to the next, with no 2 cities or contexts being alike. How did you see this accounted for in the evidence base for this variation, and then how humanitarian crises are both lived within these situations and responded to by practitioners?
Thank you, Liz. That's actually a great question. It's not just that no 2 cities are alike, but even within cities, they're so drastically different. And even within urban slums, walking from one end of one urban slum to the other end, you can see an incredible amount of variation. Housing that looks almost middle class to housing that doesn't. And so the evidence base quite simply doesn't account for this very well. It does in the one point we made that locally derived tools and locally developed scales are likely the most accurate, simply because it does take that contextual analysis into account. And that using these neighborhood-based approaches, area-based approaches that are defined by these specific communities rather than a larger geographic unit like the city, or even sub-districts within a city, the made-up polygons that you see as cities are divided. Those probably aren't very valuable in using as your unit of intervention, mostly because there is so much heterogeneity and because there's so much difference in how people may live their lives within that community to develop a perfect tool within those, or even a program. And so going back to this more neighborhood community driven methods. But again, that takes a lot of time and resources. That's the only way to actually get the most accurate. I think a balance may be, and we didn't find much evidence on this, but it may be an area of research, is how to develop some more universal tools that can be quickly adapted to various contexts. So coming up with tools that no longer claim to be the end-all be-all or apply to all cities or even all types of cities, say rapidly growing cities or cities in this region, but that can be quickly adapted, where you do a simple exercise to understand what are coping strategies or how do people get water, and then incorporate those into your needs assessment and tool. I think that might be a valuable way to go for this type of research. One last thing I'll mention and steal a little bit of my time for is going back to how to improve the evidence base. I would disagree in some of the comments made in that I actually don't want so many more evaluations published, because poor quality evaluations just add to the noise. In a world in which we're trying to delineate between fake news and real news, even evaluations that look good quality and may point to certain practice can lead to bad practice. And so I really want better quality. And so the one point I'll make is, if practitioners just sat down and wrote a methodology section, just the very act of trying to write a methodology section for your evaluation before starting a program will start to get you to think about those things that we said are missing. Just basic numbers on sample size and incorporation of addressing the bias in those populations, or how you're going to use validated instruments to measure your findings and attribute them to conclusions. Just the simple act of writing that section, which was missing from a vast number of the great papers we found, would be key to improving that evidence base. Sorry for stealing. Back to you, Liz.
Great, no problem, Ronak. That's really helpful. The next question comes back to Elizabeth. Elizabeth, one of the things that came up throughout your review had to do with attitudes around government policies and specifically views on corruption or transparency. Can you tell us a bit more about what you found?
Yes, thank you, Liz. So just quickly before diving into my answer on government policies and corruption, I'd also just like to quickly emphasize and support what Ronak just said about methodologies, about writing those prior to doing the research. And I would also go one step further, and I would say if you're commissioning or undertaking evaluation, write your methodology and then get somebody else to review it. Ideally, somebody with lots of experience at doing evaluations, perhaps a university or somebody who can help with beneficiary selection and statistics and things like that, in any kind of sticky areas where small decisions have a big role to play later on if you want to extrapolate and things like that. So I think, yes, I think absolutely support what Ronak said. And also just to go back to Lucy's comment on land tenure, which is really important, and I wanted to just flag that, yes, it did come up as a factor that hindered program implementation if there was limited land available or if there was inaccurate records of land ownership, largely because agencies are nervous about working with households where they have insecure land tenure. And in fact, to the extent that of the 11 studies, five of them, the eligibility criteria was that you own secure land. So of course, through that being one of the eligibility criteria to be on the program, you're really missing out a huge sector of the most vulnerable groups of people in that area, because of course they're not likely to have secure land tenure. You know, they'll be much more marginalized. So I think that's a really important point that Lucy made, and I think that goes to the kind of nervousness of shelter practitioners to do no harm. So to the question around local authorities, so through our research, corruption or abuse of power for private gain did come out strongly as a factor that hindered programme implementation, with around half of the 11 documents noting that it was a factor. The opportunities for corruption really were reported at 3 stages of the programme, both in the beneficiary selection process, often when a damage assessment was being undertaken, when there was a review of construction quality. So, for example, if payment was instalments, there was often an element of corruption where payments were required in order to move on to the next stage. And thirdly, in the purchasing of materials, sometimes a backhander was requested. But just to be clear, that these 3 stages, they were within the agencies themselves. They weren't. It wasn't that the corruption was coming outside the programme from government agencies or from external actors. It was really in the implementing agency rather than external. Thank you.
Great. Ronak, did you want to add anything related to corruption or transparency or issues with governance?
Yeah, thank you. So I think, as both Elizabeth and Lucy highlighted, governance is key, and understanding governance as those areas is critical. Unfortunately, the evidence review itself couldn't say enough about this. Our commentary does, because we found a lot of commentary that didn't meet quite the standards of our evidence review, but was still there. And it goes back to the point of local authorities, local knowledge is very valuable in these areas, but there may be a tend for us to romanticize these communities as idyllic and somehow perfectly run, and these community-based organizations, not just government officials, but informal authorities somehow being perfect and being the right people to work with and interact with, when that may be the exact wrong thing to do. A lot of vulnerability exists in these places because of pre-existing power dynamics. And understanding that is key, and making sure that your own programs as a humanitarian aren't co-opted by those efforts is critical. Now, we didn't find enough data on this to say that with much strength. Maybe because there's often a bias in all literature, medical, science, even humanitarian, not to study or publish negative studies where you find bad outcomes or things fail. But I would imagine that that likely will be true, and we found so many other reports, commentaries about that, and I've seen that myself in the development practice in urban slums as well. So I'll make that one comment about local authorities, both formal and informal, that can be abusive in their roles to actually malign humanitarian programs and interventions. Back to you, Liz.
Great. Ronak, a related question to that, to come back to you. Can you talk a little bit about the role of host populations in cities, particularly in areas with a high number of displaced? What does the evidence tell us about this?
Yeah, thank you, Liz. Again, unfortunately, we didn't find enough in our evidence review as it was, as we did the search strategy on shelter specifically, or even host populations. There was actually nothing on needs assessments or targeting for those types of populations. I think that there probably aren't enough of these studied to make evidence-based commentary on which tools are the most effective for those. This is still nascent, but I think very valuable. And so if a funder or practitioners wanted to begin research on that, that would be a very, very fruitful area to work on. It goes along with that absorptive capacity of cities that is understudied overall, as Lucy said. Back to you, Liz.
Great, thanks so much. The next question is for Lucy. A few of our webinar participants want to know how DFID uses evidence and what type of evidence would be most useful for decision making. I will just point out that our fourth and final webinar, which is next Thursday, the 26th, specifically looks at evidence writ large and what we learned from this project on it. But Lucy, over to you if you have any thoughts on this question in the interim.
Thanks, that's quite a big question. I would start by saying that I've noticed since I've been in DFID a real push for using evidence in the design phase of our programs. So when we want to start work on a new area, we have to do a business case, an internal document that sets out the strategic case of why something needs to be done. And there's some very, very specific questions in the template that we have to fill in about what is the evidence of what works, what might not work, where are there evidence gaps, and how will this program build on what exists and what more can it contribute. And those documents, once they're approved, they are all available on DFID's website on the development tracker. So you can search for almost any business case unless it's highly politically sensitive. And you'll see how DFID researchers, or DFID staff, sorry, have used evidence materials to make their case. And certainly there has been a big push to encourage DFID advisors and other staff who are not researchers, who don't have research background, to understand what good research looks like, and to be aware of sort of the fake news out there, as Ronak put it, so to be aware of what poor quality research looks like, and to be careful about basing program decisions on certain types of evidence. In terms of what more DFID could do with, I mean, that's a huge, huge question. I'm just thinking about my own work, which on the Urban Crises Program, that I've been working on for 3 years nearly with the International Institute for Environment and Development and with the International Rescue Committee. We've been doing a lot of work in the urban sphere on displacement, triggered by the huge displacement crisis from the Syrian situation, the refugees in neighbouring countries. And something that occurs to me that's really missing from that work is this question about the well-being of displaced populations and their vulnerabilities when they live in urban areas as opposed to when they are in camps. And I was just thinking that this is an area where we don't really know the answer. I think those of us who understand urban work and urban systems, we can see how it can be beneficial for displaced populations, refugees, to be living in urban areas. We don't actually have very much evidence on well-being, on perceptions of security, on dignity, all these questions are around sort of the outcomes of our response in urban areas versus camps. We don't actually have very much to say, and I think that would be a really powerful piece of work to understand where is it that displaced populations are best served, and where is it we can make sure that vulnerable have the best access to services, but also opportunities for self-reliance, livelihoods, etc. So from my own personal perspective, I think that's an area that we could really do with more evidence on. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. We just have a few minutes left, so we'll go to each of our panelists for concluding remarks. A theme throughout the discussion today has been that all of us, researchers, practitioners, decision makers, can work to improve the evidence base. Going to each of the panelists, what would you say are the 2 things that we could each do to generate better evidence in these areas, as well as any concluding remarks you may want to add? Elizabeth, we'll start with you.
Thank you very much, Liz. So with an eye on the clock, I'll keep it short. I guess first I would say commission better evaluations. So we're paying good money for evaluations. Let's get the most from them. And secondly, share them. As I've mentioned, please take your evaluations, find them, dig them out on your hard drive, put them up on the LNAP website. Thank you.
Great, and now we'll go to Ronak. What would you say are the 2 most important things that we should be thinking about as we come away from this webinar?
Thank you, Liz. I think we've said enough, and we can reinforce again the ways to improve that evidence base in terms of the things that Elizabeth just said in commissioning, as well as in writing methodologies and having people review those methodologies and practices that are well-versed in validated tools. But I'll end with saying that we've had a very scientific discussion about evidence and the value of evidence and how you review, but this is very much about ethics. As a physician, I'm not allowed to do something to a patient that is not evidence-based. And if I want to, it comes within very strict ethical guidelines. Humanitarian practice is not so. And unfortunately, humanitarian practice, it can be very highly unethical and lead to disastrous consequences. And it has. That's a horrible thing to say, and it sounds very grandiose, but it's very true. We right now do not have a way to stop a humanitarian from going and harming a population. And that is a major feature of our entire practice and how we are regulated, how we are licensed, how we are trained, the professionalization of it. But it goes back to evidence-based practice. And so this is why systematic reviews, creating evidence and doing the research on this are critical. And so if this is less a question about doing the thing that is scientifically the best and more about doing what is ethically right. And so that's where evidence synthesis, evidence generation lies. And so as practitioners and academics, when you think about your work, think about the ethics of your work and knowing that evidence lies at the heart of that. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much. Lucy, would you like to add your 2 things that we can do to improve the evidence?
Sure. I think much has been said, but I think also there's a case we made for building research components into programming, and this is something that the IRC has decided to do, that programs have to be based on existing evidence or they have to generate evidence. And I think increasingly donors will be receptive to having add-on research components to programs. I recognize that's difficult in the acute phase of emergency response, but there are circumstances in which it is possible to add data collection activities into our work, and also be clever about using smart technology to gather evidence as we do our programming. But perhaps more important than all of that is actually to get some of these messages out and to disseminate the findings that we're getting from our evaluations and from our research. And that's difficult, and people are busy, and they often don't take the time to sit down and read 150-page evidence syntheses. I think so. Just to finish up there, I think the more we can think about innovative ways to get messages across, the better, because change can be quite slow in the humanitarian sector, and we need to start building up, not only building up a body of evidence, but also being much better about finding ways to disseminate that evidence in digestible ways for busy policymakers and practitioners. Thank you.
Great. That ends the official section of our webinar, and we want to thank everyone so much for joining us in this discussion, in particular to the 3 panelists, and Ronak and Elizabeth representing your teams for the huge amount of time and effort that goes into doing a systematic review or an evidence synthesis. This webinar, which has been recorded, will be available on the Oxfam Policy and Practice website. Look at the events tab on that page. And please join us for the 4th and final webinar of this series, which is next Thursday, the 27th October at the same time, 2:30 UK time, 9:30 East Coast US time. And this one, the final one, will draw on reflections on the state of humanitarian evidence at large. You can find the full series of Humanitarian Evidence Program reviews, evidence briefs, and webinars on the program websites, whose links you should be able to see on the screen. Thanks to everyone so much again, and I wish everyone a good day. Thank you.